The first story, Nancy and the Mysterious Secret. Nancy was only 5 years old when her uncle, Sam, always treated her kindly. Nothing seemed off until she turned 10, and she began to notice odd behaviors from him whenever they were alone. He started touching her more often and making uncomfortable compliments. One evening, her parents went out for dinner, leaving her home alone. It was around 8 p.m. and Nancy was in bed when she received a call from her Uncle Sam. Nancy answered the phone, expecting that he might have something important to tell her, but she felt something strange in his tone. He asked her about the clothes she was wearing and spoke with an eerie voice. When she asked him if everything was all right, he responded in a sad voice, saying he felt lonely because they no longer spent time together like they used to. Despite her innocence, Nancy felt guilty, thinking she had been too harsh on him. She apologized and promised that he could take her out for ice cream the next day after school. He said goodbye with a kiss over the phone, making Nancy feel a strange sensation in her heart. She tried to convince herself that she might have misunderstood him. The next day, Nancy stood by the school gate, waiting for her Uncle Sam. Her teacher, Miss Susie, saw her and asked why she was standing there. Nancy told her that her uncle was taking her out for ice cream. Miss Susie decided to wait with her until Sam arrived. 5 minutes later, Uncle Sam's blue car pulled up. Nancy asked Miss Susie if she wanted a ride since they lived in the same direction. But as soon as Sam saw Miss Susie with Nancy, his expression changed, and he seemed tense. He didn't greet her properly, making Miss Susie suspicious. When she asked Sam to talk to Nancy's parents about something important, his face turned pale. He quickly replied that he would take Nancy out for ice cream another day and drove both of them home. When they arrived, Miss Susie spoke with Nancy's parents for about half an hour. After she left, Nancy's parents sat her down and began asking questions about Uncle Sam. They asked if he had been acting strangely with her. At that moment, Nancy realized something was off, and she began to tell them the truth. She explained how she had misunderstood Uncle Sam's actions at first, but later believed his claims that his love for her was unconditional. Nancy saw tears in her mother's eyes and anger on her father's face. Her dad immediately called Uncle Sam and threatened him severely. A week later, Uncle Sam moved to another city to live near his grandparents. 4 years later, when Nancy turned 14, she attended a family gathering organized by one of her aunts. During the party, Nancy noticed that Uncle Sam wasn't present. She overheard her mother talking to her aunt about Sam, and his name brought tension into the room. After the party, Nancy went to stay the night at her cousin Rossi's house. She asked Rossi about Uncle Sam, and Rossi's face immediately showed signs of discomfort. After a moment of hesitation, Rossi told Nancy that Uncle Sam had been arrested last month. In shock, Nancy asked, "Why?" Rossi responded, "Because he did something inappropriate with a 12-year-old girl, and her parents reported him to the police. The girl is now undergoing therapy due to the trauma." Nancy couldn't believe what she was hearing. How could Uncle Sam do something like that? At that moment, Nancy realized what had been going through Sam's mind all those years. She also understood how Miss Susie had saved her that day from falling into the second story, Reem and the Mysterious Encounter. 7 years after the incident, Reem still remembers every detail as vividly as if it happened yesterday. At the time, she was a 16-year-old girl from a large family with 2 brothers and 5 sisters. It was common for her to share a room with her sister Noor, who was only a year younger. Like many sisters, they often had their disagreements, but they managed to coexist. There was a strange rule between them. Whoever had the key controlled the room for the entire day, locking the door and keeping the key to themselves. One night, everything was normal at home, with each family member busy with their own affairs. Tensions escalated between Reem and Noor after a minor argument, causing Reem to storm out of the room in anger. As she left, Noor made a hurtful comment, but Reem ignored it and went to the kitchen to calm down. She made a sandwich and sat down to watch a show to ease her stress. Once she felt a little calmer, Reem decided to return to her room and sleep. When she reached the door, she noticed the lights were off and assumed Noor had turned them off and gone to bed. She tried to open the door but found it locked. Reem realized Noor had intentionally locked the door to express her anger, and she had the key. She began knocking on the door and called out softly, "Noor, open the door, come on." But there was no response. As time passed, her patience wore thin. Anger flared within her, and she banged on the door harder, shouting, "Open the door now! I have just as much right to this room as you do." Still, there was no reply. Suddenly, she heard Noor's voice from downstairs saying, "Shut up, it's 1 a.m. Reem felt a wave of confusion. If Noor was downstairs, then who was in the room? Reem tried to open the door again, and this time it worked. She entered the room cautiously, finding it completely dark, with the window open, letting in a cold breeze. The air outside was incredibly chilly that November night, making it absurd that the window would be left open. Reem stepped into the room, illuminated only by the cold moonlight filtering through the window, gently swaying the curtains, adding to the eerie atmosphere. As she prepared to turn on the light, she noticed something unusual under the bed. They had a bunk bed to save space, and as she glanced toward the lower bunk, she saw something white peeking out from underneath. It was a very pale hand, and the veins beneath the skin were starkly visible. A wave of terror washed over Reem. It was clear someone had entered the room through the window and was hiding under the bed. Gathering her courage, she stammered, "Who's there?" Nothing moved. The oppressive silence reigned in the room. She repeated her question, louder this time, "I see you, come out now." Suddenly, she heard a chilling laugh from beneath the bed, a haunting sound that sent shivers down her spine. It was a woman's voice, a disturbing laugh that Reem couldn't quite place. The hand began to move slowly, and a strange-looking woman emerged from under the bed. She wore tattered patient clothes, half of her body covered in burns, and she had no hair on her head. Her eyes were red and bloodshot. The woman stood in the middle of the room like a creepy statue. She slowly moved her head from side to side and began humming an old children's song in a terrifying tone. Reem couldn't bear to look any longer. She dashed towards the door, screaming at the top of her lungs, waking the entire family. Fear engulfed her, and she couldn't comprehend what was happening. All family members gathered around the room, tense and frightened. Reem told them what she saw, but most of them didn't believe her. Her father, however, grabbed a baseball bat and went with them to investigate the room. When they entered the room, it was completely empty. The strange woman had vanished as if she had never existed. But the strangest part was the wet footprints on the floor, leading from the window to the bed. Reem's father looked out the window and saw a shadowy figure climbing down the drain pipes, disappearing into the darkness of the street. Reem didn't talk much about the incident afterward, but she couldn't forget that terrifying night. Sometimes she felt that the woman she saw was a patient who had escaped from a mental hospital, or maybe just a crazy person who decided to hide in their house for sinister reasons. Whatever the explanation for what happened, the fear haunted Reem all these years, and every time she remembered the incident, chills ran down her spine. The third story, Nawal was a 20-year-old girl living a normal life, but she harbored a strange secret that had long troubled her days. She had a morbid fear of shadows. Since childhood, she had been unable to look at her own shadow, and this fear of shadows complicated her life in ways she couldn't explain. Despite her repeated attempts to overcome this phobia, it continued to haunt her. She worked at a simple restaurant, with her typical day starting at 6 in the morning and ending at 4 in the afternoon. The job was exhausting, and the pay was never enough to make her feel satisfied, which added to her psychological struggles. But she refused to succumb to this pressure. Instead, she fought back fiercely. She practiced some mental exercises that helped calm her down after long, hard days at work, and she would take long drives on quiet roads to give herself some time to think and unwind. One day, after a long and tiring shift, Nawal decided to take a drive along the deserted road near the beach. She tried to call her friends and family to join her on this short trip, but no one was available. So she decided to go alone this time. She packed her drinks and set off in her car down the peaceful road. As time passed, she began to feel a mix of tension and relaxation, but she was confident that this trip would help her unwind. After about 10 minutes of driving, Nawal felt a sudden urge to find a bathroom. She tried to hold it in until she could find a suitable place, but she realized she couldn't wait any longer. She spotted a small parking area on the side of the road overlooking the sea, surrounded by a few scattered palm trees. She decided to stop there to take care of her needs, and although the place seemed isolated and the lights were dim, she had no other option. As she stepped out of her car, she felt something strange. Night had begun to fall, and the cold winds from the sea gently swayed the trees, while the broken street lights created a haunting atmosphere. She approached one of the trees to do what she needed, but as she did, she heard a strange sound behind her. She sensed something moving slowly behind the nearby tree. Nawal looked back and saw a peculiar shadow moving between the trees. This shadow wasn't normal. It moved slowly and then advanced toward the next tree. Fear filled her heart as she suddenly realized that her car was a bit far away. While the shadow was getting closer with each passing moment, she started to back away slowly, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. As she got closer to her car, she saw something stranger than fiction. The person casting this shadow was incredibly thin, almost like a living skeleton. At first, Nawal thought it might be a ghost, but after a moment, she realized it was a real person, but one that was indescribably bizarre. He was an old man with a few wispy strands of hair on his head and sunken eyes that glimmered with an eerie light. The man's body moved in an unnatural way, as if he had no control over his movements. His fingers were long and his nails were caked with dirt, as though he had been digging in the ground with his hands for years. Gradually, the man began to creep closer to Nawal, grinning a terrifying smile that revealed missing and decayed teeth. The cold wind brought with it a putrid stench, reminiscent of something dead, making Nawal feel nauseous. But what made it even more terrifying was that the man did not attempt to chase her. He didn't run after her. He simply stood there, smiling at her as if he was enjoying watching her growing fear. At that moment, Nawal realized she needed to get out of there by any means necessary. She ran as fast as she could toward her car, and just as she was about to open the door, she heard a low chuckle from the old man that heightened her terror. When she got inside her car and slammed the door shut, she saw the man still standing there, watching her with that devilish grin. Nawal couldn't understand what this man wanted from her or why he was behaving so frighteningly. But she knew one thing. She had to get away from that place immediately. She sped off in her car, glancing in the rearview mirror to make sure the man wasn't following her. The road was dark and the streetlights barely illuminated anything, but she didn't care. All she wanted was to put distance between herself and that place, and that mysterious man. After that incident, Nawal vowed never to drive alone at night again. What had happened to her that night was beyond comprehension, and she could never explain who that man was or what he wanted. The fourth story, the creepy messages, meet Trisha, a quiet 18-year-old girl living in Mumbai, India. One ordinary night, just like any other, she was lying in bed, scrolling through Facebook before bedtime, when she suddenly received a strange message on Messenger from someone she didn't recognize. At first, she ignored it, just like she always did. But this person kept sending her messages repeatedly. Eventually, Trisha decided to respond to this stranger, who introduced himself as Andy. He claimed to be 24 years old and worked as a photographer. Trisha didn't think much of the small talk, but things started taking a terrifying turn. Andy began to describe in detail the exact place where she was sitting, the clothes she was wearing, and even the layout of her room. Fear began to creep into Trisha, especially since she had recently moved into a new apartment. Without hesitation, she blocked Andy. and made sure to double-check that all the doors and windows were locked, unable to sleep at all that night. About a week later, Trisha received another message from Andy, but this time from a different account. She was about to block him again, but before she could, he told her that her boyfriend was cheating on her. Trisha was shocked. She hadn't shared any details about her relationship on social media, nor had she told anyone about her private life. At first, she ignored what he said, but over time, she discovered that he was right. Her boyfriend was indeed cheating on her with a girl from the neighborhood. With this revelation, Trisha began to believe Andy in a strange way. When she asked him how he knew all these details, he told her he had special abilities, that God had given him talents that no one else had. In a moment of weakness and emotional turmoil due to her breakup, Trisha started to give Andy more space in her life. But as time passed, he began planting negative thoughts in her mind about her friends and family, which greatly affected her studies at university. Things gradually escalated, and Trisha could no longer bear the mental pressure. She ultimately decided to cut ties with Andy and blocked him for good. On the night she made this decision, she was studying in her room when suddenly, she felt like someone was watching her, as if someone was hiding somewhere. The lights went out abruptly, leaving Trisha in total darkness. She turned on her phone's flashlight and started searching for a candle. In a terrifying moment, she heard a sound that resembled a camera shutter. She quickly turned toward the window to see a figure sitting on a nearby tree branch. The night was dark, and Trisha could only make out his shadow. With a trembling hand, she raised her flashlight toward the window, and in the dim light, she saw a middle-aged man with an evil grin on his face, taking pictures of her. He was clearly enjoying watching her drown in fear. Trisha lost it. She screamed at the top of her lungs and bolted to the bathroom, the only place where she felt safe. She immediately called her dad, who lived in another city, and he told her to call the police until he could get to her. When the police arrived and searched the area, they found no one. However, the building's caretaker discovered that someone had broken into the electrical room and tampered with the wires, causing the power outage. From that day on, Trisha began receiving messages from strange numbers. She was sure that Andy was sending these messages, or whatever his real name was. In one of the messages, he told her he was watching her at university and that he had fallen in love with her and wanted to marry her. Her mental state deteriorated rapidly, so she decided to move back in with her family. Her dad filed a report against this mysterious man, but due to the fake accounts he used, the police couldn't track him down. Trisha closed her social media accounts and changed her phone number to ensure he couldn't reach her again. She settled in with her aunt and managed to continue her studies. And over time, she started to move past this terrifying experience. However, years later, one day, Trisha decided to log into her old Facebook account. As soon as she opened it, she found dozens of new messages in Messenger from different accounts. She started blocking these accounts one by one, but just before she could close the last message, she read some of them. Most of the messages contained words of love and longing, but there was one message that made her blood run cold. The last message read, "If you ever feel lonely, I'll always be watching you."